Thank you very much. If I could please ask you just to take your seats and we'll get going. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and a warm welcome to Minister Daniel Zeichner, Minister at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. You're very welcome, Minister. We're going to enter into our final hour before we're all being told we have to clear this room for the banquet, which is where this is going to be held, in this beautiful space. So the first session we have is on leadership for salmon, people and the planet. And what's very apparent is not only the fact that there isn't much data in certain areas, but there's a huge amount of data in other areas, and how do you break down those silos, find out what data you need for your catchment, your stream, your river, and actually take action. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully have a bit of a discussion as well. Dr. Kathryn Berry is the Science Director for the Basin Events and Coastal Impacts Project, and her research contributed to the understanding of pressures facing the Great Barrier Reef in the past and other urban and remote coastal environments, especially relating to climate change and deteriorating water quality, linked, of course, to human activities. And her overarching professional interest is that very tricky space, which is the interface between science and policy. So welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. Following up on our last presentation that took place on the eastern coast of North America, we'll actually be shifting further to the west now and putting a lens on the North Pacific Ocean and its entirety. So I'm here today to talk to you about the Basin Scale Events and Coastal Impacts Project. So the North Pacific Ocean is being severely impacted by climate change. Since 2013, we've seen unprecedented marine heat waves across the North Pacific, which are periods of abnormally warm ocean waters, sometimes lasting weeks to years. And these are fundamentally changing our marine ecosystems. Marine heat waves affect everything from plankton to top predators, disrupting food webs, altering ocean chemistry, and forcing organisms to shift their distributions into new habitats. We've seen impacts on marine birds, and then also along the coast of the Northeast Pacific. Our tidal pools lost immense amounts of biodiversity. They used to be a place to bring tourists to show them what we had in our oceans, and now there's limpets, so just slightly less exciting. The 2014 to 16 marine heat wave, known as the blob, really showed us how devastating these changes can be. So during this long-term marine heat wave event, there were increases in ocean temperature about 3 degrees Celsius above normal, spanning across millions of square kilometers of the North Pacific Ocean. And this just shows you here the distribution and migration patterns of Columbia and Snake River salmon. And you can see that when they're entering the marine environment for their ocean phase, they're going into areas directly impacted by these marine heat waves. So as I mentioned, the blob was very devastating to our environment. We saw fishery collapses, including the Gulf of Alaska cod fishery and the Bering Sea snow crab fishery, leading to economic hardships within coastal communities in this region. The Pacific salmon also told us a compelling story during this time. These iconic species face depleted food sources, increased predation, disrupted migration patterns, and then distribution change as well in the open ocean. After these marine heat wave events, salmon returned smaller, younger, and in dramatically lower numbers to their home rivers. One thing to note is that these changes cross borders and jurisdictions, impacting whole ecosystems. To respond effectively and properly understand them, we need to bring together information and people and expertise from across the North Pacific region. The blob really helped us to reveal a lot of these critical gaps in ocean monitoring systems and the research networks that we have right now. So despite excellent regional efforts, our fragmented approach meant that we weren't fully prepared for these heat waves events coming. Some of them, we didn't really know about them. They caught us by surprise. In some events, we maybe knew they were coming, but we weren't ready to respond and send researchers out to do monitoring during the event to actually capture as much information as we could about what was taking place and changes being observed. And because of this fragmentation, we're still learning slowly over time, piece by piece, about the impacts and implications from these events. And we're expecting that more information will continue to trickle in as the years come. And if we consider Pacific salmon here, while individual regions tackled local impacts, we did lack a coordinated system to really understand how these changes were affecting the whole life cycle of salmon, from entering the marine environment, going out, spending those years in warmer water, and then coming home. And we now face a new challenge. It's a new challenge, but it's also a potential new opportunity. There's a new heat wave that's actually developing off the coast of Japan right now, and it's been estimated that in potentially 5 years' time it will reach the Northeast Pacific. So we have an opportunity to learn from the past lessons of other heat waves and bring knowledge together sooner to try to more holistically understand the impacts of these extreme climate events on salmon. And this is where BECI comes in. BECI was co-developed by the North Pacific Marine Science Organization, PICES, and the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. Both organizations have decades of expertise in transboundary marine science and salmon research. And I'm proud to say that our project has been endorsed by the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. At the heart of BECI's mission is a simple yet powerful goal. We're going to build a North Pacific Ocean Climate Knowledge Network to unite information, people, and support climate-ready informed decision-making. And we're going to tackle this through 3 strategic approaches that are interconnected. The first is learning from the past. We're going to take information from these past heat waves, bring them together for more advanced syntheses to create a more holistic picture of what ocean conditions changed and the repercussions on the salmon and other fish species. This will give us just more information moving forward that we can build upon to create adaptive management strategies, and then also forward-looking planning. The second is understanding the present. We have so much amazing information these days. We have NOAA, who are predicting these extreme marine heat waves. We have NASA collecting all this amazing satellite data showing primary productivity and ocean temperatures at the surface. We have Argo floats going through the whole North Pacific collecting ocean temperature data more at depth. And we really want to work together on bringing these different information sources together so we have more real-time or near real-time ways to track oceanographic indices. And this is particularly important for these marine heat wave events. This will also allow us to focus on who's doing what research where, identify gaps, share best practices, and align efforts. We really want to work to reduce redundancy. We're all working towards similar challenges. Research is expensive. Processing samples is expensive. So we should come together more often and reduce these costs and share our expertise and knowledge. Now, the final approach is preparing for the future. So as was mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of new innovative technologies, modeling techniques, advanced analytics, and artificial intelligence that are helping us to do a better job at predicting how climate change may impact fisheries into the future. But we're still working on what the best practices are for this and standardization of these techniques. So we're going to work with experts in this field like FishMIP, which is an international multinational group of modelers who are looking at best practices on how to take Earth system models and downscale them so they can be used in fisheries models. So this comprehensive approach connects past lessons, current practices and actions, and future solutions. And we're tailoring this knowledge network not just to fisheries managers, but also to researchers, NGOs, and community members, and also industry. To turn knowledge into action, Becky is also developing a suite of tools, such as interactive platforms like dynamic maps and visualization interfaces, knowledge products such as syntheses, ecosystem status reports that can be created in more timely manners, and then also climate adaptation planning tools. So for example, right now we have the Canadian government making risk assessments for climate change and salmon within their boundaries. The United States is also doing it. But we're forgetting that these fish are moving across each other's borders. So we really want to work with these government organizations on a more holistic regional risk assessment, for example. And also beyond these tools, Becky is really focused on fostering collaboration. We've heard a lot from regional fisheries management organizations that they want to connect with each other more. They want to learn from the challenges that are common throughout the groups, but how different organizations are dealing with them. So we're going to establish discussion forums, webinars, and multinational working groups. And this will really bring together diverse voices. And I also just wanted to take the opportunity here. This shows a breakdown more of just the functioning of what the knowledge network will look like. And you'll notice that it's not just about data. I have information here, and I also have knowledge. And this is because this effort is not just going to be data-driven. We're not only focused on Western science. We also are going to include Indigenous perspectives and traditional ecological knowledge and ways of knowing. So we have engagement planned with Indigenous peoples from both the United States and Canada to learn more about how Becky can help them to communicate with each other about some of the climate change challenges they face. And we're also interested in talking to fishers, people who are out on the water every day experiencing how these environments are changing. And you know, they're not collecting water samples and then coming up with answers, but it's knowledge that they're gaining by being there in person day after day. That's important to us too. We really want to make sure this knowledge network is inclusive of multiple voices and can have broader impacts for, you know, beyond people making decisions. So bringing this back to salmon, I just wanted to provide a brief use case study that is focused on salmon, and I've called it the North Pacific Salmon Ecosystem Dashboard. So building off those, the structures that I talked about earlier, we have an opportunity now to really learn from the past. So many different salmon populations from across the North Pacific, Russia, Japan, the United States, and Canada have been impacted by these marine heat waves. Now is our opportunity to bring that knowledge together and really look more in detail about how those ocean conditions changed and then what the repercussions were on different populations spread across the region. When we think about the present, we know a marine heat wave is coming. It's a massive opportunity to actually track those changes over time and ground truth to see whether some of those past lessons we've learned can actually be implemented now as we move forward. I've put in here too monitoring of ocean and river conditions. I think it's really important that we stay connected even as people are working on different spaces and life stages of the salmon, because for example, during some of the marine heat waves, it was almost a double whammy. While some of the fish out in the ocean were experiencing warmer temperatures, so were salmon in the streams. So it's important to know if the freshwater environment is also experiencing unfavorable conditions. That's great to know, because there may be implications on the numbers of salmon that actually survive and make it out to the ocean phase, and vice versa. So having a little bit more information and connectivity between groups in these different spaces will help us make better informed decisions and plan for the future. And speaking of planning for the future, all of this information can go towards more early warning systems. We've been hearing from a lot of our stakeholders at government organizations that they want better information on when conditions are becoming unfavorable so they can send their researchers out and collect the data they need to actually support their decision making. So, more broadly speaking, what could your role be in Becky? If you're a scientist, imagine the benefits of knowing that what work your peers are doing and how it connects with yours, and being able to develop research programs together to resolve these problems with facilitated collaboration and limit less resources. If you're a resource manager, imagine being able to participate in a working group with other resource managers working on similar challenges where you can learn from each other, build off mistakes and successes, and save time and money. And this just isn't just for salmon people. Like, it's so wonderful to have these conversations with salmon-focused experts and salmon lovers, but we just have to keep in mind too that there's so many other fish out there that are experiencing similar conditions, their populations are declining, and those managers are having troubles too. The challenges are very similar, so even just connecting across different species and fish of focal interest, we can help facilitate that. If you represent an NGO, think about how our collaborative platforms could amplify your work. So this really is an opportunity to be part of a multinational movement towards securing a sustainable ocean future. So I ask that you join us. Becky's still in its infancy, but the foundations are strong and the possibilities are endless. And that's something that gets me really excited about my role. As we bring more information together, we're just going to have new questions, new tools that can be developed, and new ways to collaborate together and learn more from this synthesized information. We're looking for partners, funders, collaborators, and just champions. So please do join us. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to talking to you more this week. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Kathryn. We've heard a lot about catchment level management. With it comes an awful lot of data from which evidence-based decisions need to be made. Can be difficult. But there is, as we heard from Professor Helm yesterday, this potential to run what-if scenarios and use AI and all the rest and the power of AI to ensure coherent, effective action that works. And on that general theme, our next speaker is going to talk. Dr. John Emery is a mathematical modeler, and he's the theme leader for data management and analysis at the Atlantic Salmon Trust. And he's also the project manager and co-principal investigator on the likely suspects framework, which he developed with Dr. Colin Bull at the University of Stirling, and he's going to talk a little bit about it now.
Okay, well, first of all, a huge thank you to Kathryn and to the organisers for bringing us all together, and to yourselves for coming together to focus on solutions for the wild salmon crisis. So I'm going to start with this fantastic footage from Richard Davies, who I think is in the audience, who's an ambassador to the Atlantic Salmon Trust. And I start with footage of wild Atlantic salmon because they're the focus of this talk. And the reason I've chosen it is because I think it's hopeful. And I think we have reasons to be hopeful. Because despite all the pressures we've talked about on wild Atlantic salmon, the really complex life cycle, the real difference between the catchments that they're born in, despite our finite resources, despite our limited time, and despite the sheer amount of work we have to do, we do know what the solutions are. We know what wild Atlantic salmon need to thrive. But we need a way to navigate through that complexity, so that for a given scale, and I'll talk a lot about catchment scale here and catchment scale restoration, we need to be able to identify those actions that will have the biggest impact on salmon restoration. We need a way to prioritize those actions, and we need to turn them into evidence-based catchment restoration plans. And it's exactly the sort of methodology that Professor Helm talked about yesterday. And I think if we don't have those methodologies in place, we risk making ineffective or perhaps even counterproductive decisions. So that brings me to the likely suspects framework. So the aim of this project is to mobilize evidence and undertake original research where there are gaps into salmon mortality right the way across the life cycle. And that's in order to support decision-making for salmon restoration and to empower people to take action. So it's a strategic research project from the Missing Salmon Alliance. It's 3 years into a 5-year plan. And the rest of this talk is going to be about how the likely suspects framework is designed to support that decision-making. But it's really important to stress that the outputs from this project are not a panacea for salmon. The outputs are designed to sit alongside and within existing tools and processes and organisations and initiatives. But if we get it right, there's a prospect to be really important tools for turning evidence into action. So how are we going to do that? This project relies on really 3 components that feed into each other. I'll mention them briefly now and then talk in a bit more detail in a moment. But the first is modelling. It's about mapping the complex life cycle with a model. And this is the framework part of the likely suspects framework. The second part is evidence. It's about mobilising existing evidence and generating new evidence where there are gaps into salmon mortality right the way across the life cycle, and importantly, it's hanging it on that modelling framework. So these are the likely suspects. And finally, I finish with tools. So these are really important. They're the vehicles for turning evidence into action. That's about embedding all of that evidence and all of that learning into practical, accessible, intuitive web applications for use in the decision-making process. So an example might be to assess the impact of different actions on salmon populations within a given catchment. So I'm going to start with modelling. So I said there's many pressures, and we've heard a lot about these pressures right the way across the life cycle, from egg to par to smolt, out to sea as post-smolts and back as adults. And by mapping that life cycle and being clear on what those life stages are, within the project we can tag on where those pressures are and where those interventions are, and that has 2 really important outputs and uses for the project. The first is our shared understanding. It's a common language. It's a conceptual framework. We can add in new information and communicate information. The second is it's the mathematical engine that drives the rest of the project. And that's important because these interventions often have unintuitive results. So we need a mathematical and a full life cycle approach to understand cause and effect. I think a good example here is the marine environment. You might say we're going to do things at catchment scale in our rivers and estuaries. So why do we need to include what's happening at sea? And I would argue it's the marine environment. By getting a better understanding of the mortality in the marine environment, it tells us about the tide that we're swimming against when we're taking action at catchment scale. So we have our framework, and we want to try and mobilise evidence and generate new evidence where there are gaps. And one key gap I just mentioned is the marine phase. And I'm going to focus here on 1 or 2 aspects of the early marine phase in our coastal waters. So this is really important because our smolts have just left the river, the diet has just changed, they're about to travel a very long way, they're smaller, and they're not as robust as their adult counterparts. This is a really sensitive time in their life cycle. And so we need to have an understanding of this portion of the life cycle. And so researchers from the likely suspects framework have been looking under the bonnet of this phase in more detail. So a couple of outputs here. On the left-hand side is taken from a paper by Emery at the University of Strathclyde, who's been looking at zooplankton, which is the prey of salmon. And she's seen significant declines in our coastal waters, and importantly, they are in line with declines in returning adults. So there's an important empirical mechanism, a tangible mechanism for mortality, or one of the drivers of mortality at sea. On the right-hand side is an output from a paper by Aislinn Borland, and you've already heard some of her different research earlier today, again from Strathclyde, who's been modelling the pathways of smolts as they leave Irish and Scottish rivers up to the coast of Norway. And that's really important because we can combine this with empirical evidence from acoustic tracking projects to see how post-smolts interact with marine development on their way up the coast. So they're both important research outputs for the whole community, but they're also really important within the project because we can combine them with climate change projections and that modelling I talked about to get a much more detailed understanding of this driver of mortality at sea in space and time. And so by space, I mean catchment by catchment, and time, I mean projections 5-10 years into the future. So finally, I want to come to tools. These are vehicles for turning evidence into action, without risk, which I think we risk leaving all of that hard-fought learning and evidence in papers, and they might gather dust on a shelf. So we want to create easily accessible, intuitive, web-based apps to make sure we can mobilize that learning. So the first example I want to talk about is SalHub. That's a data mobilization platform. It brings together disparate, often difficult to find, difficult to access data sets right across the life cycle, and it puts them in one place to access. And importantly, it's built on that conceptual framework I mentioned, so it's consistent and easier to find and access and to use. So SalHub is live. It has over 500 data sets available. It's growing. I encourage you to look when the slides are circulated. There's a link at the bottom there. And Graham Dyack, who's a data specialist with the Missing Salmon Alliance, has been to an invited workshop in Alaska to share the learning from developing SalHub with our Pacific colleagues. So the second tool I want to talk about is it's a decision support tool. It contains all that evidence and modeling I mentioned, and is configurable to a specific catchment. And it lets us assess the impact of interventions on salmon populations in that catchment. So the way this would work in practice is a catchment restoration manager would take the tool with the evidence and the modeling built in, would fold in, and this is really important, local data and knowledge and expertise, and then possibly use other tools, and I mentioned here Fishery Management Scotland's pressure assessment tools, would then assess the impacts of those actions and develop a catchment restoration plan. And really importantly, there would be a line of sight from those actions all the way back to that local data and the evidence that was folded into it. But it's important to bear in mind again that the tool is part of a wider catchment restoration process. It's not designed to replace a process. So that's how the Likely Suspects framework is designed to turn evidence into action and empower solutions for wild Atlantic salmon. How would we make sure it does that over the next couple of years? And at this point, I'd liken it to a project to develop a new off-road vehicle that you might use for field work, quite technical. So there's still some research and development to be done to make sure it's fit for purpose, that it does everything it's supposed to do in the product spec. It's working in principle in a lab or in a factory. But we also need to make sure it's working out there in practice, out in the field, that it's a tool that people want to use and they can rely on and trust and use in, day out. And that's all about working with stakeholders. So I come back to the decision support tool. That's all about detailed user testing and acting on feedback, case studies on real catchments, providing detailed guidance, a library of worked examples, and a legacy plan to make sure that these tools stay fit for purpose so they themselves don't get put on a shelf. So we've had several workshops with stakeholders across our community already, and that engagement will increase. And we're testing the tool on 3 catchment scale restoration projects on monitored rivers. So that's the River Laxford in northwest Scotland, the River Devon on the Moray Firth, and the Froome in the southwest of England. And that's been partly made possible by our connections in the Missing Salmon Alliance and our partnerships with the Missing Salmon Alliance. So I'm going to leave it there. I want to say that I represent a much wider team of brilliant people that have been doing the great work behind me. And I want to highlight they're a really multidisciplinary team. So we're modelers and ecologists and fish biologists and oceanographers and data specialists, all working towards solutions for wild salmon. And I think that mirrors what we're doing here at Wild Salmon Connections. So a big thanks to them and to Colin Bull, who's, I mentioned earlier, is an extremely knowledgeable researcher from the University of Stirling, as I'm sure you all know, who's been with the project from the beginning. Him and I will both be around if you want to ask questions. And we also have the tool live on a stand outside as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. Before we hear from the Minister, we're going to have a reasonably brief final session looking at enhanced collaboration to meet a shared goal. And we're going to ask Alan Wells from the Missing Salmon Alliance to come up for a discussion in a minute. But first, we're going to hear a little bit from Kim Damon-Randall, the President of the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, who's going to go over a little bit about the organisation, and then we'll have a discussion after that. Kim.
So I think I'm going to stand off to the side a little bit. Wendy told me I wasn't tall enough to be seen over the podium, so I'll just stand over here. We've talked a little bit and heard a little bit about NASCO, but I'm not sure if everyone knows about it, so I thought I'd give a little bit of background about the organization and then talk about some of the things that we're doing that are new, that are probably unfamiliar to many. So I think One of the things I want to point out is NASCO has been around for almost 40 years, or over 40 years. It was established by the Convention for the Conservation of Salmon in the North Atlantic Ocean. There are 8 parties to NASCO, and you can see the flags there. It's Denmark, in respect to the Faroe Islands and Greenland, Canada, the European Union, Iceland, Norway, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. And one of the things that NASCO does is they generate resolutions, agreements, and guidelines that help to guide the work on various things that are affecting Atlantic salmon challenges. The organization was originally established really to address the high seas directed fisheries for Atlantic salmon. And that was dealt with relatively quickly. They were very successful in reducing that targeted catch. And they realized after that happened that there were other things that were affecting salmon. So they started focusing and broadening the area of focus to things like management of salmon by states of origin, salmon fisheries by states of origin, habitat protection and restoration, and aquaculture transfers and transgenics. So the scope of the organization broadened, even under the convention that was really targeted towards those directed fisheries. The resolutions, agreements, and guidelines focus on those 3 key theme areas that I mentioned. And one of the things that I think we've talked a little bit about today, and I think is of great interest to many in the room, is related to aquaculture. And NASCO has worked with the International Salmon Farming Association, ISFA, on some guidelines or goals for aquaculture, 100% effective sea lice management, and 100% containment of salmon in production facilities. And in 2022, at the annual meeting that we had for NASCO, the organization issued a statement on aquaculture. And in that statement, they recognized the status, the conservation status of Atlantic salmon, and that we have an urgent crisis on our hands, and then also urged the development of innovative technologies to reduce the threat from aquaculture to wild Atlantic salmon stocks. So that's been what's going on in the recent past, but in the last year and a half or so, NASCO has undertaken a process to really look at the organization and what the organization wants to do over the next 10 years. And this is really prompted by something that NASCO started in 2014. They started having theme-based special sessions on those key theme areas that I mentioned. We got recommendations from those. We had a performance review. We had a symposium in Tromsø in 2019 as part of the International Year of the Salmon effort. And out of those different things came a bunch of different recommendations on things that NASCO could be doing differently or better. And so the organization wanted to look at all of those recommendations and figure out what we could do differently given the urgent crisis that we have on our hands for Atlantic salmon. So we went through a process of identifying or kind of refining the vision of the organization. And we came up with our new vision, which is the decline of wild Atlantic salmon has reversed, and populations are recovering to healthy and resilient levels across their range. And then to achieve this vision, NASCO's mission is to support and promote urgent and transformative actions that are directed at the protection, conservation, and restoration of wild Atlantic salmon throughout the species range. So these are 2 very important things that are sort of guiding the work of the organization over the next 10 years. And we came up with a strategic goal that we really wanted to really focus in on, which is part of a bigger strategy and action plan that the organization has developed. So the strategic goal is within the next 10 years to prioritize and drive actions necessary to slow the decline of wild Atlantic salmon populations and demonstrate that restoration is possible. We wanted to make sure that our goal, our vision, our mission, all of those things were achievable within that 10-year scope that we're talking about. And so we didn't say that Atlantic salmon will be recovered throughout their range. We said that the decline will be halted and we'll begin that process of recovering the species or restoring the species. So we have the strategy that lays out the process that we're going to undertake, and then an action plan that's associated with that strategy that identifies the actions that the organization is going to take, that the parties have committed to, and that some of our other partners are going to be working on. So that's what we've been up to in the last year and a half, is really honing in on what the organization can do in the next 10 years to really urge that transformative action that needs to be taken to turn things around for Atlantic salmon across their range in the North Atlantic. So I think that's all. I just wanted to go over that really quickly, and I think then we were going to do some questions.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you. We have 10 minutes or so for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, just start waving at me and I'll see you at the corner of my eye. Alan has joined us from the Missing Salmon Alliance. Alan, just briefly tell us a little bit about that and I suppose the work you're doing.
Yeah, well, hopefully everyone knows by now that the Missing Salmon Alliance is a group of conservation-focused organisations that are working together to highlight the wild salmon crisis and to urge urgent action from governments, from businesses, from fisheries organisations, and also from financial institutions. And that includes concerted action to address the range of pressures that wild salmon face. So I think you've heard throughout this, this meeting some of the fantastic work that's going on the ground by Alliance members, but also in the case of Fisheries Management Scotland and the Rivers Trust, by our respective memberships as well. So you've heard lots of examples of that during the day. We've also just heard from John about some of the science work that's going on through the Missing Salmon Alliance, and some of that fantastic work that's happening in the marine environment that's just building that picture of the pressures that wild salmon face as they move into the marine environment, and the likely suspects framework and some of the tools that will come forward which will help us to make good decisions on the ground going forward. But ultimately, if we're going to be successful as an alliance, we also need to raise the resources to help do the work that we need to do so urgently to support wild salmon. So we're also exploring nature finance mechanisms to try and bring that really important money in so that we can make a difference on the ground and help to protect our fantastic wild salmon.
Thank you, Alan. Kim, I mean, we've heard the word extinction, urgent. We've only got a very short period of time, beyond which, as someone was saying earlier, you'd have all this data and all this action, but no salmon left. Have you shifted into a new gear to respond to that urgency?
Yeah, I definitely think NASCO has shifted. I think in the last few years, I think the recognition of the climate crisis has really, the climate crisis and the impacts to Atlantic salmon has really been acknowledged by NASCO. And I forgot to mention in my remarks that climate change and the impacts to Atlantic salmon is an underlying factor in all three of the theme areas that we're looking at for NASCO. So I think there's definitely been a recognition that urgent action needs to be taken. That's why this strategy is built on trying to take actions within the next 10 years to turn things around.
And do you think there is 10 years?
I think it depends on maybe where you are. I think the United States, we did hear earlier today that Maine is seeing some increases, which is a really good sign. But when you look at the size of the population in Maine versus the size of populations elsewhere, an increase is good, but it's still a really low population. I hope we have 10 years. In the U.S., I think we do. I think there's lots of work going on across the range of the species that I think is helping to turn things around. But I think we need to do more, and we need to do it quickly.
How do you hold the parties to account?
So in NASCO, we have an implementation planning process. So each party and jurisdiction is responsible for identifying with those three key theme areas that I mentioned earlier, actions that they're going to take to address those things. And then each year at the meeting, at the annual meeting, we have a special session where anyone in the audience can ask questions of the parties and jurisdictions about what's in their implementation plan and their associated action plan, and really hold them to account for doing the things that they're saying they're going to do to take action to restore the population.
I just wonder, I know we were speaking about this, but the US State Department has this way to push governments to act on human trafficking. And they basically give them, like a teacher, marks out of 10. And they will downgrade them if there isn't enough action. And that comes under a certain threshold with economic implications in terms of trade with America. Governments don't like that, and it's a very effective tool. And I wonder, soon does NASCO need to look at something like that in order to really make sure that action happens?
So we're going through a process right now on the next reporting cycle, and that can be something that we can consider. The way of holding the parties accountable, parties and jurisdictions accountable, is through that public process of calling out if action isn't being taken. And I think the NGOs, our NGO partners who are really important to NASCO, are very good about identifying things that aren't being done and can use that as an opportunity to really hold NASCO accountable to the actions that they say they're going to take.
Alan, will you talk a little bit about, the members of the Alliance have developed joint policy objectives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we're going to get them up on the screen, but we've developed just a series of high-level policy objectives. Maybe they're not coming up on the screen.
Do I need to press something to make that happen? No.
No. I don't have them in front of me, so it's a bit difficult to talk to. But basically, we've set 5 high-level policy objectives, which are very much deliberately high-level in the shape. And essentially, it's a framework by which anyone can amend or enhance them for use in any jurisdiction. What's really important, and came through in a meeting that we had of all of the NGOs at the start of this week, at the start of this meeting, is there's a real appetite for NGOs to work together in a coordinated, concerted action to try and make a real benefit for wild salmon. So the whole purpose of developing these objectives, which you can see on the Missing Salmon Alliance website, is to basically form a framework by which the NGOs can work together and potentially set something up where we have a clear, consistent, evidence-based policies that we can work together to try and make a difference for wild salmon.
Kim, you were saying to me earlier the importance of storytelling and that that's an area that you want to do a bit more work in. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so during the process of working on the revised vision and mission and everything, we talked a lot about the fact that you can go into a grocery store pretty much anywhere and buy Atlantic salmon, and people don't understand that if it's readily available in a grocery store, they don't understand that there's something going wrong with Atlantic salmon. So I think one of the things that we really highlighted in the process that we've been going through is the need to try to get the messages out there. So it's messages to the public, it's messages to policymakers, politicians, everyone that we have a problem, it's urgent, we need to do something about it. So that storytelling discussion we had yesterday really resonated with me, particularly from being from the United States and on the East Coast. The connection to Atlantic salmon on the East Coast of the US, the cultural connection has sort of been lost because the populations have been so low for so long. There's still, a pretty good cultural connection in Maine, but elsewhere in the U.S., it's very diminished. It's very different for Pacific salmon, and Pacific salmon get a lot of attention because that cultural connection still exists. They get a lot of resources too. So helping to really spread the message about what's going on, get people to understand it and really want to work toward, doing good things. I forget his name, was it Jim that was up here? He was very passionate. Having someone like him talk to people who don't know what's going on with Atlantic salmon, I think would work really well to get people behind the need to do something urgently.
And finally, for me anyway, you talk about healthy and resilient being the goal, and I'm just wondering about sort of shifting baseline syndrome. Can you define that in terms of what you consider to be healthy and resilient?
So I think healthy is, the populations are much higher than they are now. Resilient is that, especially in the face of climate change, they have the ability to go where they need to go. So removing barriers, ensuring that cold water refugia and other types of habitats that they need are available, giving them the best chance in this uncertain environmental situation that we're in.
Any questions? Yes, do we have a microphone? We do.
Thank you both, Kim and Alan. Accountability, Kim, what's the formal structure between yourself, NASCO, and the aquaculture companies? So what's formally in place? There's not a law as such or regulations. It's just, how do you get them to do what we want to do at the moment?
Yeah, so I think the resolutions, agreements, and guidelines that we have are things that have been developed over time to try to identify things that have worked for maybe one party that another party can apply, so that they're the way that NASCO functions to try to address the challenges with aquaculture. We do have ISFA attend the annual meeting at times. They were on the agenda. They have not been coming in the recent years, but we do have the ability to have them come to an annual meeting and talk to them about what needs to be done. But it's really through, I think, through trying to take action, the parties and jurisdictions taking actions, that I think that we have the industry. The industry can ignore NASCO, I suppose, but they can't ignore things that are happening by the parties and jurisdictions. And NASCO is really designed to work across the North Atlantic in the high seas. It's not designed to develop domestic policy that each of the parties have to undertake.
Alan.
I think that was the point I was just about to make. It's ultimately up to the parties to decide how they want to deliver the commitments to NASCO.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you. Alan and Kim, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you, Kim. Alan, I'll hand over to you.
Just like to say thank you very much again to Ella for once again steering us so expertly through the day. As I mentioned earlier, today's an important day in the House of Commons. Notably, the water bill is in the final stages of consideration. And given the focus of our discussions here, we do of course hope that the bill recognises the importance of the Water Restoration Fund to river restoration and to delivering the UK government's environmental improvement plan. Within that context, we're particularly grateful for the UK Minister of State for Food Security and Rural Affairs to take the time to join us today. And I'm therefore delighted to welcome Daniel Zeichner to the stage. Minister.
Well, thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to be able to address you. The plight of wild Atlantic salmon is of concern to all of us. I have to say I'm really inspired by what I've heard in the short time I've been here at the conference today and reading about the conference that you're holding yesterday and today to address the challenge of the threat to salmon populations. And it's part of a wider challenge, it seems to me, because nature decline is a major issue facing all of us. And I can tell you the Secretary of State, my ministerial colleagues, and myself take this challenge really seriously. Now, it's a new government. Last summer, when the Secretary of State took charge, in his very first week, he set out 5 key priorities for the department in which I serve. And 2 relate very directly to the issues that are under discussion here. One is to clean up our rivers, lakes and seas, and the other is to ensure nature's recovery. And at the Oxford Farming Conference a couple of weeks ago, when the Secretary of State set out his plans for farming, nature recovery was one of the 3 key parts of that. So this is central to the work the government's doing. Now, historically, of course, there's been a strong tradition of both commercial and recreational salmon fishing across the UK, and it's a key part of our culture, I'd say, as well as, of course, historically bringing in many millions of pounds each year. But today, there is no commercial salmon fishing in England. And recreational salmon fisheries, while they still make a valued socio-economic contribution, operate largely on a catch and release basis, and rightly so, to protect remaining stocks. In 2023, only one of England's 42 salmon rivers, the Tyne, which I think you heard about this morning, was classed as not at risk, which underlines the continuing downward trend, sadly, in salmon stocks. And has been explained today, the pressures facing Atlantic salmon are serious and wide-ranging. They go far beyond directed fisheries and are often difficult to manage. So it's clear to me that we have much more work to do to restore salmon populations. But listening to what I've just heard in the last few minutes and hearing from others over the last few months, I'm confident that if everyone plays their part, we can make a real difference to the survival of this iconic species and those who rely on salmon to make their living. Now, there is, of course, an international dimension to this. While DEFRA's priorities, my department, while DEFRA's priorities to speed up nature's recovery and clean up our rivers, lakes and seas will benefit salmon, we cannot do it alone. Atlantic salmon's vast geographic range means we must work with international partners to protect this species. And the UK is committed to international collaboration through our membership of the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, NASCO, that we were just hearing from Kim. And I'm delighted to say that the UK will be hosting NASCO's 2025 annual meeting in Cardiff in June this year, and I hope many of you will be able to attend. Because NASCO makes a real difference. Just to give two examples that focus on reducing fishing pressures. The annual quota for the West Greenland salmon fishery, set out in NASCO's West Greenland regulatory measure, is now just 27 tonnes, down from 870 tonnes in 1984. Closer to home, NASCO guidance has enabled the UK nations to determine minimum sustainable stock sizes or conservation limits for key salmon rivers. And this has led to the cessation of almost all commercial fishing and a transition to catch and release recreational fishing on almost all English rivers. Just 250 salmon were retained in England in 2023, almost all on the Tyne. However, as we've just heard, and as NASCO's new strategy recognises, salmon are in crisis and more needs to be done. So despite the progress made on fishing effort in West Greenland, NASCO must keep scrutinising this fishery and prepare to negotiate the next measure in 2026, noting the continued decline of the species. Now, bycatch is another important issue. The scale of risk it poses remains unknown, and gathering robust evidence on bycatch is essential. Once bycatch is better quantified, NASCO can assess what international action is required. Now, with salmon's decline, the role of stocking is receiving ever more attention. And I've recently received several letters from groups seeking to increase stocking in the southwest. I would say in passing that one of the most effective pieces of campaigning came from groups in the southwest, who very early on sent me a magnificent salmon plate with their campaign mission written on the back, and it has pride of place in my office. So every day when I sit at my desk, I look at the salmon plate. So it means that the issues that are dear to you are always in front of me. But I had to point out to them, I was pleased to point to them, to NASCO's new stocking guidance to reiterate that stocking should be a measure of last resort, preceded by, or at least run in parallel with, wider habitat improvement work. But all of this illustrates the value of NASCO's best practice guidance, and the UK government will continue to contribute to NASCO's work to update guidance on stock rebuilding, habitat improvement, fisheries management, and aquaculture. Now, back in England, the Environment Agency is currently undertaking the NASCO-initiated National Stressor Analysis for England. And I'd like to thank many of you in the hall today for contributing to this assessment, which will inform the collaborative development of priority actions for salmon. But it's not just about new actions and new priorities, though. Many existing commitments will deliver for salmon. Water quality is recognised to be a key pressure on salmon populations throughout their life cycle. Plans setting out the water industry's forthcoming actions to meet the environmental requirements will be published soon. The Environment Agency are analysing how and where this might deliver for salmon. Now, of course, sewage pollution is recognised as a key contributor to poor water quality. The Water Special Measures Bill, which you just heard about, and indeed, according to a message on my phone, the discussion in the final stages in Parliament started about 5 minutes ago, which means that my colleague is probably at dispatch box now proceeding with it. The Water Special Measures Bill will drive improvements in the performance of the water industry. But to go further, the UK government and the Welsh government have launched an independent commission into the water sector regulatory system. And the commission will report by June of this year with recommendations on how to tackle inherited systemic issues to help restore our rivers, lakes and seas to good health to meet the challenges of the future. But also good land management practices also play a key role in ensuring good quality freshwater habitats. And my department's Landscape Recovery Fund offers farmers and land managers the opportunity to work together across landscape scale projects to deliver ambitious environmental outcomes through bespoke long-term agreements. Over half of the 56 of those projects currently in the project development phase are located in important catchments for salmon. Many are focused on river restoration and are planning various interventions that may benefit salmon. These include renaturalizing river channels, increasing riparian vegetation, which can help cool rivers to mitigate climate change impacts. But of course, diseases also present a real threat to salmon. So robust systems of import checks, border inspections, post-import surveillance and sampling programs significantly reduce the threat of pathogen introduction to our waters from live, fresh imports. And to protect salmon populations from the threat of Gyrodactylus salaris specifically, an ongoing wild fish monitoring program checks salmonids for infection on 10 river catchments on a rotational basis each year. Now, despite these significant commitments, in addition to the Environment Agency's work on salmon fishery management, I fear that DEFRA and the Environment Agency are unlikely to ever have enough money to drive forward all the actions needed to conserve and restore salmon. So it's so important that the environmental non-government organisations and fishing associations represented in this room play their part. I know that you hold a huge amount of expertise, motivation and resource. And my department and the Environment Agency are committed to working with you to unlock that potential. Now, the Environment Agency have already sought your input to develop an improved understanding of the pressures affecting salmon through their England Fisheries Stakeholder Engagement Group. And I understand that this group has also started exploring how to bring together the right stakeholders at the right scale to identify and deliver key actions to mitigate these pressures. So, in conclusion, I'm really grateful for your expertise. I recognise the value of your contributions to English salmon recovery. We are stronger and have a far better chance of improving the state of salmon when we all work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for joining us today at this really important event for wild salmon. Today we've heard a lot about pressures on wild salmon at sea and in rivers, and it's clear that in the UK, land use is one of the biggest pressures that we have the ability to address. And the members of the Missing Salmon Alliance also look forward to the UK government's response to the Water Commission later this year. As we highlighted earlier today, managing land with water at a catchment scale is fundamental to achieving nature restoration, and the time to act on this is now. So looking back on the whole day and our focus on environmental leadership, I want to thank all of our speakers for their presentations and the engaging discussions that we had. And maybe a round of applause for all of the speakers today would be really good. So we heard about bycatch, and aquaculture, and other marine developments, and the challenges they can pose to wild salmon and the health of our wider natural environment. But it was heartening to hear some of the solutions and discussions that took place around these issues. It's also inspiring to hear what we can achieve together for salmon and the wider natural environment if we work in partnership and in collaboration, as we heard in the Save the Spring project, for example, but many of the other presentations that we've heard over the last couple of days as well. I spoke earlier about some of the policy efforts we need to enable further progress, including greater penalties for polluters to act as a real deterrent, and the urgent need to implement a framework of actions, for example, the Scottish Wild Salmon Strategy, and I know that work's underway in England to pull something together for that as well. As we've said throughout this conference, wild salmon need cold, clean water, and we must all play our part in making this happen. So tomorrow we'll be focusing on the future, and our keynote speaker is Alistair Fothergill, director and co-founder of Silverback Films. For those of you who have registered for a banquet this evening, I look forward to seeing you back here at 7 p.m. for drinks before the banquet begins at 7:30. But as we alluded to earlier on, in order to allow our fantastic hosts here today to get this room ready for the banquet tonight, can I please ask you not only to vacate this room as soon as possible, but actually to move downstairs so that they can move tables around and get them into here. So again, thank you very much for your participation today. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you either later tonight or back tomorrow. Thank you very much.